Toyota has given much to the world in their devotion to automotive engineering, but few items have made as big of an impact as the JZ engine platform. Today, let's dive into the Japanese inline-six world and see what's so special about the Toyota 2JZ. Okay, so let's start with the least known fact about Toyota that actually surprised me when we were doing the research for this video. The company started its life as Toyota Automatic Loom Works. So they were actually manufacturing looms and sewing machines for the textile industry. The part of the business is still running to this day. The automotive part, the one that we're interested in, didn't really kick off until the early 1930s. Toyota, spelled with a D, as it was named after its founder, Sakachi Toyoda, released its first domestic vehicle, the Model A1, in 1933. The company changed its name to Toyota with a T in 1936. Now, there's a bunch of theories as to why that might have happened, but the most commonly cited one is that in Japanese, D is a voiceless consonant, which apparently is not very pleasing to the ear. So it was changed to a T, which according to the experts sounds stronger and more pronounced. Moving right along, in 1956, Toyota began selling vehicles and their first export vehicle through their newly established worldwide dealer chain. The car was the Toyota Crown. Since then, Toyota has grown in size and reach, surpassing GM in 2008 to become the world's largest car manufacturer, a title it still holds to this day. All right, so that's a bit of Toyota history. Let's now turn our attention to the subject of today's video and arguably Toyota's best ever engine, the mighty 2JZ. But before we get all nitty-gritty about this famous inline-six, we really should quickly talk about the hero car it powered, the Toyota Supra. So let's step back in time again to the 1970s. Toyota's direct competitor, Nissan, was seeing major success with its Z platform. Toyota's own sports car, the 2000 GT, had been popular, but due to its limited production, it didn't really return a profit. Needing to pivot quickly, the Toyota engineers stretched their existing Celica platform by nearly 130 millimeters and elongated the engine bay to house the M Series inline-six. Dubbed the Celica Supra, Latin for go beyond, these would be the first of 5 generations of the Toyota Supra. The M Series went on to power 3 generations of Supra, but by the late 80s it was getting a bit long in the tooth, so Toyota devoted its efforts into developing the new inline-six platform. The new motor was a 24-valve dual overhead camshaft dubbed the 1JZ. It was first used in 1990 in the Supra Mark III and the Crown. While it was adequate, Toyota quickly saw a need for a larger displacement JZ engine. And with reliability in mind, they created a new, taller 3-litre design. The 2JZ that went into the 1991 Aristo was a tall-deck JZ engine that featured a shared bore and stroke, making the engine squared. Now this means that it's got 86 millimeters of stroke and it's got an 86 millimeter bore. They call that a square engine. 2 versions of the 2JZ were made, the naturally aspirated 2JZ-GE and the more popular twin turbocharged 2JZ-GTE. The latter, twin turbo version, finally gave Toyota an engine that could take on Nissan's RB26 head on. 2JZ? No shit. Now here's where things get a little odd for the 2JZ. Production variants of the 4th generation Supra were made with both the turbo and the non-turbo variants, but Toyota never officially campaigned a 2J in any form of motorsport. Well, why? Toyota invested a considerable amount of time, money and resources developing an engine for their WRC effort. And since the Japanese touring car rules allowed any production engine to be used in their cars, Toyota opted to power their JTC Supras with their 3S GT power plant used in their really successful WRC Celicas. Remember the Tom's Supra that was immortalised in Gran Turismo? Yep, never had a 2JZ. Or what about the HKS Drag Supra? Well, the Mark III ran a 7M, and the Mark IV used a UZ-based V8. It wasn't until a few years into the Mark IV Supra production run that privateers began campaigning and developing the 2JZ platform. Notably, the Blitz tuning Supra tackled the Nürburgring modified production car record and claimed the title in 1997 with their impressive 7-minute 49-second run. But no one could have expected that a street racing film from America would make the Mark IV Supra and the 2JZ one of the most popular engines in the world.
Pop the hood.
It's a bonnet,
Lift the
dickhead.
bloody bonnet.
Jokes aside, this film and the explosion of drifting as a motorsport helped grow the market into what we know today. The 2JZ, as mentioned, came in two variants. The naturally aspirated GE powered the Mark IV Supra, Aristo, Crown, Chaser, and Soarer, respectively. In 1997, they upgraded to the variable valve timing setup, and they remained that way throughout till the end of production. The GTE model was a direct competitor to the popular Nissan RB26 DE-TT from the Godzilla Skyline. But in this, the block, the crankshafts and the connecting rods are shared with the GE. However, a new aluminium high-flow cylinder head was developed alongside new, larger valves and higher duration camshafts. The biggest difference, aside from the cylinder head, are the oil spray nozzles installed under the pistons in order to help pull temperature out of that piston and help with lubrication. This and the shorter piston to lower compression ratio makes them a much more desirable option for the average enthusiast. Again, like the GE, variable valve timing was added in 1997. One of the most important changes to note is the conrods in the GE VVTi engine compared to all of the others. The GE VVTi engine has the weaker conrod capable of around 500 horsepower at the wheels compared to the rods in all of the other variants of the GTE engine and the GE non-VVTi engine that are capable of about 1,000 horsepower at the wheels with an unopened engine. So that means if you're looking for one of those bulletproof engines, stay away from the variants that came from the IS300 or the aspirated 2JZ VVTi Soarer. While the 3-litre inline makes respectable power in stock form, many owners seek out more power by replacing the factory turbocharging setup. Remember that that's a primary and secondary style turbo system, they don't work at the same time. Ditching the restrictive factory exhaust manifold and turbocharger setup, usually in favour of a big single, can easily bump up the power output. Whether or not you choose to try and modify your stock ECU is up to you, but considering we've been in the engine management game for nearly 40 years now, we'd recommend ditching that old archaic system and heading to something a little bit more high-tech. We've developed a complete replacement engine harness that suits our Elite 2500 series ECU. Or if you're looking for something a little bit simpler, we even offer a plug-and-play adapter for the Mark IV Supra that uses your existing wiring harness and adapts to put an Elite 2500 in place of your factory old-style ECU. Terminated harness looks something like this. It's got a fuse box assembly, that's got a power supply for your fuel pump and power supply for the whole engine management system. It's got the connectors for the Haltech ECU, a little breakout here for the CAN port for stuff like your wideband oxygen sensor or your Haltech IC7 dash. Then, if I just elegantly drop this on the ground, we've got a heap of wires. We've got a grommet here that goes in your firewall. So this part of the harness is all inside the car. Then this side is the engine bay side. Pull this down. We've got all of the factory connectors here to suit all of your factory sensors. Everything plugs in. It's all at the right wiring length. Then all you need to do is plug it all together, load the base map, hit the key, and then your 2JZ in your Daihatsu Charade, your Toyota Celica, your whatever you want, hit the key, the thing will start and run. So this is one of the easiest ways to get one of your engine conversions up and running. If you're in the market for a used engine, be warned that finding them will only get harder as time goes on, and that means you're going to hate what I'm about to do to this engine. Being out of production for over 15 years means that finding a wrecker with a good used piece will be difficult. That said, these engines are known to be dependable, and other than normal signs of wear and tear, there's nothing that you'd really be looking at that'd make you skip out on buying one if you did find it. The valve guide seals are known to fail pretty early on. Look out for smoke out of the exhaust on startup, and that's a good indicator that the valve stem seals might need replacing. If you're considering the VVTi model, look out for sludge in the valve covers. This will be especially bad if the VVTi cam gear is leaking. Another potential issue is sludge or oil debris clogging the VVTi solenoid's filter screen that's located right here. We'll get to that in a little bit. All in all, these 2JZ engines, if pulled from a wrecker with a good service history, should be a great option to swap into your project car. Now, before we strip this thing down and have a look at what makes it tick, this is the third inline six that I'm about to tear down in the What's So Special About series. So we've done the RB, I've done the Barra, and now the 2J. For me, I'm into the 2J part of it, and it's not that I don't like the other ones. Obviously, I love the Ford Barra. Big 4-litre capacity. As a factory engine, it makes heaps of power. Unfortunately, its downside is it's physically a very, very big motor, meaning that it is a little bit tricky to shoehorn a Barra into a smaller style car or smaller engine bay. So that makes that a little bit difficult. The mighty RB26, obviously I have plenty of love for that thing as well. However, being the 2.6 litre 6-cylinder, the thing doesn't have quite as much torque down low, which makes drivability not as great as sort of what I would want from an everyday driver, racer, street car style thing. The 3-litre 2JZ with the variable cam control, this thing's got huge potential to make excellent horsepower, but is also a really, really drivable engine, and it does fit in a heap of the cool cars, which is why I think that the 2JZ, it is the great all-rounder. It really is an excellent engine. Now, the only 2JZ I could get my hands on is the one I just told you that is the one not to get, the one with the small con rods. What we're gonna do, we'll wander around. I'm just gonna start stripping as much as I can, putting them in that box, and we'll see what's inside the 2J. Now, this is one of the things I was talking about before about the coil packs. So some of the engines, the turbocharged setups, had 6 individual coils. This VVTi engine has a wasted spark ignition system. And what that means, I'm just gonna pull out here the coil that's mounted as a direct fire style coil over cylinder 6, choose it to seen better days. And then it's got a plug lead that goes to cylinder 1. So what's happening there, oh geez, that one's horrible as well. So what's happened there is we fire that coil twice per engine cycle or twice per cam revolution. So it's firing on the cylinder that needs that spark, but it's also firing a wasted spark on the opposing cylinder. This way, manufacturers can have one coil and one plug lead. Probably reduces costs a little bit, but that's known as wasted spark. This engine, Mitsubishi Evos, also run a wasted spark style system with one coil and one plug lead as well. Now that we've stripped the front covers or the timing covers off the engine, we can see our 2 camshafts up the top. We can see our cam belt. So unlike the Barra and like the RB, the 2J uses a timing belt. It's got our 2 cam gears up the top that are the 2 big ones. We've got our tensioner, which is a hydraulic tensioner here for that belt. Then we've got our crank pulley down the bottom. Remembering as well, this is one of the things that everyone always forgets about, that this is a 4-stroke engine. So that means that the crankshaft is spinning twice to the camshafts once, resulting in a full engine cycle. So now that we've got some of the pretty covers off, we're down to the business end. We've got the camshafts up the top here. This is a JDM, or Japanese domestic market, or Australian domestic engine. The USDM, American engines. Interestingly, the exhaust camshaft is the same in that engine, whereas the intake camshaft of the American engine is actually a bigger profile. So it has more lift and is claimed to make sort of 5, 8, 10 horsepower more than the JDM version. Because this is a VVTi engine, it's got a crank trigger down the bottom here that's got 36 teeth and 2 missing. So we call that a missing tooth, or a Motronic style of trigger system. So 36 minus 2 on the crankshaft. Up the top here, we've got 3 teeth on the camshaft based 120 degrees apart. That's known as the Toyota VVTi style of trigger system. It's not just found in the 2JZ VVTi. A lot of the 4-cylinder series, a lot of the V8s, like the Mighty 1UZ, also has the same style of trigger system. So commonly manufacturers will share the trigger type they have, and that's suited to the engine management system that engine manufacturer uses. Because this has got our 36 teeth down the bottom and the 3 teeth up the top, the 3 teeth give us enough information to phase exactly where that camshaft is relative to the crankshaft, and that helps us to do our variable cam control. So what's going on up here, if I twist this a little bit, what we're going to see is that I'm actually moving that cam gear independent of the camshaft. And the reason for that is this solenoid here. It's a 2-pin solenoid that the engine management system controls. So it puts a pulse into this solenoid. This solenoid will either be opening, closing, or holding the pressure that's within that solenoid. And its job is to either advance the intake camshaft in order to give us better low-end torque, but reducing top-end power, or it's going to be retarding the camshaft, giving us better top-end power, but losing the bottom end. In the case of the 2JZ, when we pulse that solenoid, it's going to do nothing because there's a little filter in here that gets clogged all the time, resulting in bad VVT control. If you've got one of these engines in your car at home and you think that might be an issue, better show you how to pull that out and clean it. If I pull out this bolt, it's known as a banjo bolt. This is the same style of bolt that you might use in like your turbo coolant line, stuff like that. It's a really clever thing. So what it is, it looks like a normal bolt, but it's got a hole in the middle of it. If I just pull the back side here, there's a washer, normally a copper washer on either side. So there it is. That's the copper washer from one side. That's the one from the other. That sits in there. When that tightens up, it sits around this bit here. It seals, and then oil can actually go through that bolt then into whatever line it's connected to. So a really clever way of moving that fluid. So this thing here is our electronic cam solenoid, and the thing that I've been speaking about where the engine management system pulses here, that electrifies the solenoid in the middle here, in turn moving this piston up and down in the bottom bit here, which determines where the oil goes in order to move that inlet camshaft around. So the way that that system works is if the engine management system pulls that duty cycle down, for example, oil will start flowing out of the solenoid and it'll retard the camshaft. If the engine management system starts bringing the duty cycle up, it's going to let oil in and it's going to advance the camshaft. There is also what we call a steady state duty cycle. On this engine, on this setup, it'll be about 42%, give or take at around 120 hertz. That's the position that the solenoid sits at. So 42% duty cycle, that's the lock position. So if that solenoid's sitting at 42%, that means that the camshaft has found its target position and it'll get locked there until it gets instructions from the engine management system to move again. Now keep in mind that's happening really, really quickly. Your tuner is normally mapping that across a 3D table of engine load versus engine RPM, maybe the coolant temperature as well, because the engine oil does need to get up to temperature before these things work effectively. So it is a very, very high-tech thing. Even though it's a very simple solenoid, it is doing a heap of work inside the engine. Part off. So what is actually happening here, I'll just wipe all this oil out. The first thing you'll notice is that these dents on the outside of the camshaft have got a little section missing here. Likewise on the camshaft, if I pull this gear out so you can see it, There's a missing set of teeth there as well, and a seal. Sometimes these seals leak, that's another thing with the VVTi engines, but that's how you locate it to put things back together. And what's happening inside here is that we're either filling this void with oil or releasing that oil in order to advance or retard that inlet camshaft. Where we're up to here is a really, really impressive piece of engineering. The manufacturers needed to get oil into the front of this cam gear in order to change the inlet cam timing. But you can't exactly just put a braided line or a hard line or something to the cam gear because the thing's spinning, right? So the way that they do it is we've got engine oil at engine oil pressure. Let's say it's 20, 30 PSI when it's hot at idle. Let's say it's 80, 90, 100 PSI when it's hot at redline. That oil pressure comes up, it's filtered obviously, it goes through one of these galleries at the top here which is sealed into the nose of the camshaft, then it travels through the middle of the camshaft over to this side, so outside of the camshaft and outside of the rocker covers, then comes out of this gallery here through an oil seal like an O-ring, so that's spinning so no oil comes out, then gets fed through the cam gear, comes back out through one of these holes and fills up. When we need to release it, likewise, there's a second gallery that comes back. It's really, really impressive. Every now and then they do have VVT oil leaks, and in that case, probably not a bad idea to do your timing belt at the same time, pull the gear apart, put new seals in it, put it back together and she's away. There she is, one ginormous, heavy, thick, reliable camshaft, 2JZ. The other side, exhaust side, same sort of construction. She's an absolute monster and there's a fair bit of weight to that. That is a reliable, solid thing. Now that the cylinder head's off, we've found the head gasket. So not so much 2JZ specific, every engine's got a head gasket, but if you haven't seen this before, it's an interesting thing. So when they talk about you've got a blown head gasket, so probably you Subaru guys, this is the head gasket. What's happening here? Think of it like a sealing surface between the engine block and the cylinder head. When it blows, what that means is that we've either got oil and water mixing within the head gasket surface here, so that's when you get the milk, or you get the the oil in the radiator, or you get the milky oil in the engine because you've got coolant inside it, or it's the compression area here. So the seal around the actual cylinder pressure that's gone, and then that means that when we get a combustion event, it'll push that compression. So instead of pushing this piston back down, it might bleed into the cooling system and it pressurizes your cooling system, which is probably the most common thing. That's when you get that funny smell in your radiator. Might pop a radiator hose, it might blow the top off your radiator, but that's the head gasket. That's what it does. It seals your coolant from your oil and your compression from the block to the cylinder head. It's pretty hard to get to. You can see how much work would go into it to replace this in the car. That's why doing a head gasket in the car is an expensive job, as it's probably the hardest gasket in the whole engine to get to. We've now got our cylinder head on display, we've got our camshafts. The camshafts are made of a cast steel, and because this engine is the 2JZ VVTi model that was the non-turbo variant, these camshafts have got a 233 degree intake camshaft, it's got a 226 degree exhaust camshaft. The lift about the intake 8.25, the exhaust is about 8.41 millimeters of lift. What's really nice about the 2JZ is the way that the camshafts actuate the valves. Instead of having rocker arms, instead of having a bucket with a hydraulic adjuster, these things are solid bucket and shim. So what that means is that normally the camshafts are up here, spinning around. We've got the cam lobes, these bits here, so that's got the profile of the camshaft, so when the valve opens and when the valve closes. That lobe runs on the tops of all of these buckets. It's got 4 valves per cylinder, so that means that it's got 2 intake valves and 2 exhaust valves. But what I want to show you is how this solid lifter arrangement works. In other styles of engines that have got like a rocker arm, for example, you might have a rocker arm that's got a hydraulic adjuster in it. So that means that it adjusts, it takes up the slack between the camshaft lobe and the top of the valve, for example. Whereas in these ones, they're solid. You can get these in 2 styles. They could be hydraulic in another style of engine, meaning that engine oil gets in there and it adjusts itself, so that adjusts your clearances. Whereas in this case, they're a solid lifter. So let me try and just pop one of these out. I've just got a magnet here. Okay. So that's our solid, what we'll call our bucket and shim arrangement. We've got the valve, the top of the valve here. We've got our collets and our retainer, so that's what's holding the valve spring in down here. This bucket and shim arrangement sits on top. The camshaft rides directly on top there, and then watch this. This is the shim. If I can just pop that out, there we go. So, the tedious job of arranging all of the shims, so your engine builder will have a whole bunch of different sized shims that they'll assemble together. They'll gently sit in there. They just sit in there. They use the oil to kind of, it's not a compression fit, but it's a super tight clearance fit. They can spin around in there. That'll sit back down. Then, once the camshaft goes back in, we can measure those clearances there and make sure they're all within tolerance. With the cylinder head flipped over, we can see that we've got our intake valves, we've got our exhaust valves here. There's plenty of meat between the cylinders, and there's a heap of water jackets in this cylinder head, giving the engine really, really good cooling, meaning that, especially on the VVTi engine, they could increase the compression ratio a little bit. If you haven't seen an engine like this before, I've got a screwdriver here. This is the actual combustion chamber in here. I'm just going to pop the screwdriver straight through the middle here just so you can see when you're replacing your spark plugs. That there is where your spark plug tip would sit and produce that spark. That's where we've got our air and fuel mixture, which makes that controlled combustion, which turns into power. Another lovely thing about the Toyota 2JZ engine is that you don't need to heavily port the cylinder head to make huge power. Obviously, if you do port it, that is going to allow it to flow more air, in turn making more power. But for a high-powered street car, often a factory cylinder head is all you need. When we have a look down here, we can see our inlet valves. It's a real straight shot, straight down there. We've got a little relief in the tops here of all of the intake ports, and that's where the fuel injector sits and sprays in. And on this old, poor example of a 2J that we're stripping down, you can actually see where the petrol has been keeping that inlet clean there. Around the outsides of it all, it's all black and tarred up and all a bit gross. So this engine was probably ready for a strip down anyway. Another thing that's nice to have a look at here is the match porting. So when you hear someone talk about match porting, when the inlet manifold goes on here, you can actually see that it's been covering a part of the cylinder head, so that if we were to get a die grinder and open up that inlet port in order to get rid of all that shape, we might end up getting rid of a little bit of turbulence, a little bit of disturbance on the air intake track, and that might be worth a little bit of horsepower and a little bit of torque. On this side of the casting, there's not that much here. We've got the 6 exhaust ports. We've got the really nice coolant galleries along the top that keeps that cylinder head nice and cool, which helps us to make power. The studs in this holding the exhaust manifold on are a whole lot nicer than the Nissan because they've actually got the hex style stud on the top, meaning that if we do want to pull them out, we simply put the socket over the top and wind them out. Nice and simple. Once the engine's flipped over, we can have a look at the front sump here. It's got the oil drain on the side, pretty straightforward. But what I wanted to show you was this back section here that acts as almost like a girdle across the bottom of the engine. It's got a whole bunch of 10 mils to pull the sump assembly off, but then we've got a whole bunch of 12s and 14s along the whole back half here that helps to strengthen the block and tie all that back end together. Now, before I pull the oil pump on this thing, and I don't mean to keep coming back and comparing between the RB and the 2J, but it's hard not to. We know that the RB's got a problem with the oil pump where the crankshaft has got two flat surfaces that drive the pump, whereas when we pull this thing apart, have a look at this. So, oil pump off, we've got a geared drive on the front here of the crankshaft, so that's direct off the crankshaft, or that's the nose of the crank. Here's our oil pump. And look at that, a whole bunch of gears. So what's happening when we're revving this thing, it's loading that oil pump across every single one of those teeth, rather than just the two surfaces like the RB that eventually get a bit of wear in them, get a bit of slap back and forward, and that's where they smash gears. This style of gear-driven pump is one of the upgrades that we would do on a Nissan RB engine. I promise we're getting close to the crank and the rods, but while we're in the back here, I took the ring gear off before. So this is the bit that the starter motor engages to start the engine. It's also in this automatic equipped engine. This is where the torque converter would have bolted to. Then the gearbox would have come across the back there. Get rid of that bit. Then the reason why I wanted to point this part out, we pulled this bit off. This here is the carrier for the rear main seal. So there's a seal in here that runs directly on the crankshaft. This one's actually seen better days as well. But you might have heard people say, oh, I've got an oil leak from somewhere between the engine and the gearbox, and the mechanic will tell you, oh yeah, it's the rear main, and that's when you have to pull the gearbox off, pull this apart, pop this seal out, and then replace that part. Again, a tiny little seal, it's probably only worth 20 or 30 bucks, but a huge amount of labor to get to. And you know we're getting to the very, very bottom of it when the piston and the conrod come out. So that's it. The first thing we'll point out is this cute, teeny, tiny little conrod. Not quite what you'd expect out of a 2J, right? And that's because we've got the GS300 variant, the one with the skinny conrod that's only capable of, say 500 horsepower, but even that might even be a stretch, to be honest. If we pulled apart one of the turbo variants or one of the ones that we mentioned as the ones that have the larger conrod that support around 1,000 horsepower unopened, or stock bottom end we call it, it'll have a lot thicker conrod than this tiny little thing. Don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure that this is actually what the Toyota V12 conrod looks like as well. Super skinny, something that doesn't hold a whole lot of power. Up the top here, we've got two compression rings, then we've got the oil control ring, got nice skirt on the side of it, quite a big gudgeon pin. So the gudgeon pin is the bit in here, the steel pin that's joining that conrod to that piston. The piston is a simple aluminium casting, and it's got some reliefs for the valves up the top here. On the bottom side, if we just pop that back together, it's got some locating pins so that you know which way around things connect. That's where the bolts go through to hold that bottom together. And the crankshaft is normally sitting in there. The bearing and the width of the crankshaft here gives us a heap of area, and that means that the more oil, the more pressure we have here between the crankshaft and the bearing, the less work everything is actually doing. So having that nice thick surface there is a really good part of this engine build, and one of the reasons why these bottom ends stay together. These are the last bolts in the engine. These are the mains. So these are the ones that are holding the center line of the crankshaft in. So we'll pull these out. These have also got bearings in them. The bearings actually look pretty good. 1, 2, 3, and fourth one, the center has a different bearing to the others. So I'll pull this out, have a look here. So we've got a bearing in the middle, which looks really good, but we've also got these things. So this here, I'll pop that out the other side as well. This is known as the thrust bearing. So what's happening here is that these are sitting on either side of that main cap, and they're stopping the crankshaft from wandering in this direction, back and forward. So if you've got, when you press the clutch, for example, when you're sitting at the lights with your foot on the clutch, you're actually putting load on the crankshaft and pushing it forward, and that is loading these, the center bearing or thrust bearing, we'll call it. This is also the position where on some other styles of engines, you would machine out and put, they call a Torrington bearing, which is more of a needle style bearing. Depending if you've got a torque converter set up, a huge automatic transmission setup that puts a huge amount of pressure and a huge amount of thrust on the crankshaft, going to a Torrington style bearing in the middle might be an option for you. In order to determine whether you've got worn center bearing or a worn thrust bearing, we can typically put a measuring tool across the nose of the crankshaft here. We then push the crank in and out, or we can push the clutch in and out depending on what setup you're at, and you'll see how far the crankshaft is moving, and there is an allowable tolerance there. The tool on the front, use something like a dial indicator for that. And there's no bolts left, so the crankshaft, that is a solid, heavy unit, and that's the reason why a crankshaft like this can run 220 mile an hour, it can make 2,000 horsepower in any of these Pro Mod cars. This is a serious bit of gear and something that is very desirable for the 2J community. A 2JZ crankshaft. So what's so special about the 2JZ? Well, for me, it's the crankshaft, it's the oiling system, it's the huge journals, it's the awesome oil pump at the front, it's the girdle that holds the bottom end together, it's the lovely solid bucket cylinder head. This is a great engine. It's special because it can make 1,000 horsepower, well, not with those rods, with the good ones, from a stock bottom end engine. It can make 2,000 horsepower, 3,000 horsepower when you put obviously all of the Pro Mod style stuff into it, but the cast block does handle it exceptionally well. It's special because it's got a whole bunch of factory functions that we're now using and retrofitting into other engines. The 2JZ is a special thing. As with all the What's So Special About episodes, I always have an absolute ball stripping these things down, knowing that I don't have to put them back together. And thank you for sticking through to the end. I know that the 2JZ is an exciting engine that everyone wants to have a little bit of a look at, but sometimes doesn't have the access to. If you've got an engine that you're interested in that you think everyone else would like to see me strip down, leave it in the comments and I'll do my best to get my hands on one. As always, thanks very much for watching. My name's Scott. Catch you next time.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, smash that like button. We put out a new video every week and sometimes even two. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more awesome content.